Hi, Principal Matters listeners. This is Will Parker, along with my co-host Jen Schwanke. And before we jump into today's episode, a fantastic interview with Frederick Buskey, Jen and I are going to respond to a listener question. This has become, as Jen would say, a fan favorite. So, Jen Schwanke, this listener says we are entering a new quarter, a new part of the school year. If boundaries need to be reset, what do you suggest? Oh my gosh, what a question.
Right. It's very vague, but it's also could be very, we could pinpoint that to a lot of different areas.
Hmm.
My first,
Yeah.
well, you go first. You go first.
No, well, I was just thinking fresh starts are a good time to sometimes remind people of what boundaries are. You do that with students. And I think doing that with your school community, it's not a bad idea to just take a step back and ask, okay, are there some areas where we may be not staying in line with what we said are our values? Or some of our practices or things are getting a little sloppy. And so it's not a bad idea to do a quick assessment. I think it's important, though, that you don't use what I call the shotgun approach, where you shoot everybody if there's only one or two people who are needing to be realigned. So resetting boundaries, I think, can be important in a general sense to just remind everybody what your values and mission are. Resetting boundaries in particular, it might depend on who needs to be reset. And sometimes those are better in one-on-one conversations. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that the word boundaries stopped me a little bit when I looked at this question, because I wonder if this listener asking this question really meant boundaries, or if they meant norms, or
Mm-hmm.
they meant habits, or they meant expectations.
Mm-hmm.
Boundaries is a tricky word because I think it implies somebody has personally encroached on something that's yours, and
Mm-hmm.
I'm gonna assume this listener didn't mean that. So I think what I'm getting at here, Will, is the first step for me would be drill down to what you mean by boundaries.
Yeah.
I have started to ask my team a lot, what problem are we trying to solve? Get to
Mm-hmm.
the root of that. So are you, principal, are you feeling personally overwhelmed? Are you feeling your school isn't focused on the right things? Are you feeling like teachers are overwhelmed or too lax or too anxious, or get to the root of the issue that makes you feel boundaries are not being set or being adhered to? And then once you have that question really solidified and everyone agrees on that as the problem, then I think you just hone in on this, and there's where your answer and my answer really merge.
Yeah.
No shotguns. Just get really down to the core of what needs to be reset. And it might just be norms. Hey guys,
Yeah.
remember what we talked about with meetings? We're
Mm-hmm.
going to 1, 2, 3, 4. It could be very simple, and then you move on.
I'll add one more thought. And I love that clarity, Jen. I'm going to steal this acronym, but probably mentioned it before from Brene Brown, who says when she thinks of boundaries, she thinks of BIG, big. Um, the B being when I set appropriate boundaries, I'm giving you my expectations of what is allowable, not allowable, what I'm comfortable with, what I'm not comfortable with, what I can commit to, what I can't, which leads to I giving me the opportunity to work with you with the integrity, because now we're working with a clear definition of what is acceptable and isn't acceptable, which means we can be the best versions of ourselves, which leads to G, what she calls generosity, which means that now I can actually be more generous in the way that I treat you and respond to you. So sometimes saying no, it can be hard when you're setting boundaries too, but it actually allows people to behave as better versions of themselves. And so I love how she does that, just that quick little reminder that boundaries aren't to restrict as much as they are to free us to be the best versions of us. So,
Well, we need to do a
yeah.
whole podcast on the word boundaries, because I always imagine a playing field and you can't go outside of certain lines. Like that's the boundary. No soccer or no field hockey is played beyond this.
Mhm.
And I think that's a really good analogy for a lot of the work we do in schools. So maybe this is a word we can base an entire episode on.
Well, Principal Matters listeners, thank you for giving us 5 minutes to respond to listener questions. And I know you're going to love today's episode with Frederick Buskey. But until the next time you hear from Jen and me. Thank you for doing what matters. And you can always reach out to us through my website at williamdparker.com or through my email at will@williamdparker.com. And Jen, how can they find you?
They can find me anytime at jenschwanke.com.
Thanks, Jen.
Thanks, everyone.
Principal Matters Podcast, episode 415. Hi, friends. This is Will Parker, host of Principal Matters, the School Leaders Podcast, where each week we bring you inspiring, innovative, and imaginative ideas for your own school leadership. This week, we're going to be talking about reclaiming your purpose with my special guest, Frederick Buskey. Frederick Buskey helps assistant principals and leaders live and lead better, building on 32 years of K-12 and higher education leadership experience. Dr. Buskey provides simple frameworks and tools to help school leaders spend less time putting out fires and invest more time in growing teachers. Dr. Buskey hosts the Assistant Principal podcast and writes a daily leadership email. He hosts courses for leaders at his Strategic Leadership Academy. He's just this past spring released his first book, A School Leader's Guide to Reclaiming Purpose. You can read more about Dr. Buskey at his website and connect with him on LinkedIn. Frederick Buskey, welcome back to Principal Matters Podcast. You were a guest back on episode 356, but you've got a new book that's come out, and I can't wait to talk about it. But before I do, why don't you fill in the gaps on that intro and tell listeners something they may be surprised to know about you?
Well, Will, first I'll say it's great to be back. Thank you for having me again. I guess the big thing, since when this is coming out in June, a year ago, my wife and I did a long distance hiking trail in England called the Pennine Ways, a 270-mile through hike that we did. So I don't advertise that all the time, but getting out into nature and the outdoors is just one of the things that really recharges my soul.
Well, it recharges mine too. And you and I have a lot in common. And obviously, you and I could talk about this for a long time, Frederick, because we talk offline. We are friends that like to connect around school leadership. My Principal Matters listeners know that I often record episodes way in advance. So we're recording this in the spring of 24, but we're going to be releasing this later in the fall because of that schedule. But I remember back in June when you guys went on that trip, and I want to be you when I grow up. So someday I want to do that trail. We have a daughter, the Parkers, my family, our daughter Katie lives in Wales, and we've gotten the chance to hike the coastal paths there, and we'll be going back summer of 2024. So by the time this releases, I'm hoping I will have been back on some of those beautiful trails. So I have to ask you one question about that before. So how long were you guys on that trail? And like, what would be the story you would want listeners to know of why they should consider doing something like that themselves?
Yeah, so the first answer is not long enough. I there's two things I just cannot not talk about. So the first thing is the simplicity of that. And we carried everything on our back. So I had a pack weighed 20 pounds that had the kitchen, the bedroom, everything in it. And when you strip all of the stuff away, life becomes really simple. So I always joke that the biggest decision we had to make each morning was, were we going to have hot oatmeal or cold oatmeal, right? So, and then that simplicity leads to the next thing, which is presence. I have never, Will, been more present in my entire life. You know, I have that monkey brain. So I'm always thinking about the next thing or this and how to make that better. And this is the first time I can remember in my life actually going days of not thinking about leadership, of not thinking about work, of not thinking about anything. And what I discovered is when we are fully present, the small things are as beautiful as impressive as the big things.
Mhm.
You know, it's easy to be out on a big hike and you see this cascading waterfall and you just think, wow, that is so cool. And you can immerse yourself in that moment. But when you're fully present, you can look down and see this tiny, teeny little yellow flower, and you can marvel at the incredible beauty within that tiny flower.
Mm. You're reminding me of some of the favorite memories of my mother because she was that kind of person who, in the crazy bustle of raising 6 kids and living out on a farm and then following my dad through his military career, it didn't seem to matter what setting we were in. She was that person that could always find that small, beautiful. In her older years, I remember once walking out in the woods with her and some of the grandkids. And I came back because she had stopped to look at something and I wanted to plow ahead on a trail. So I came back like an hour later and she was in the same spot with one of the grandkids on her knees, just marveling at this plant that she had found near a tree because that's what she wanted to do. And I just thought, I think she may have chosen the better thing, than my plowing ahead on the trail. So thanks for that, Frederick. I think one of the things you and I like to talk about is how finding meaning also motivates us in our work. So before we even jump into your book, talk a little bit about what you're doing right now. What are some of the things that you're currently involved in so that Principal Blenders listeners have some context?
The big project that I'm focused on right now is building out a whole concept and series of support tools around this idea of classroom culture. So I coordinated beginning teacher programs for about 6 years. So really passionate about getting those new teachers into the profession. And of course, one of the huge elements of that is classroom management. And I think the bedrock of classroom management is classroom procedures. So I've been doing classroom procedure workshops with new teachers for years. And it's funny because I always start out with saying, the most important thing in your classroom management is building relationships with your kids. Now let's look at classroom procedures. And I never hit the piece of helping them understand how you build relationships with kids. And some teachers, they do that naturally. My wife could walk in a classroom and she just did it naturally. I had to work on it because I'm so task focused and want to get to the content and I care about my kids, but it was easy for me to neglect the relationship piece. So what I've done now is kind of back up and think about, okay, it's not just about management, right? It's how do you build a culture in your classroom? And so it's relationships, it's the management piece, and then what I refer to as safety. We can think about discipline, but how do you handle safety events in a way that maintains a positive culture and kind of de-escalates and makes it easy then to move forward and bring people back into that culture. So I'm working on that piece, and what I'm really excited about is building out a series of courses that really break things down into nuts and bolts. So as a new teacher, I can go in and I can watch the courses and it really takes it down to a finite level. But then also building complementary courses for school leaders. Because one of the things I've seen is I'll talk to an assistant principal and they'll say, yeah, we have this teacher struggling with classroom management. I've talked to them about it, but they haven't acted on that. And sometimes what those conversations look like, because I'm a busy assistant principal and because I'm making assumptions about what that teacher already knows, is, hey, I see your, classroom's loud and some things are going on, and you should consider these 3 procedures. You should implement these. And then the teacher doesn't implement them, and I get frustrated and think they're not coachable. But what I've learned in talking with teachers, new teachers, is they don't have the requisite skills or knowledge many times to implement procedures. So as an administrator, I say procedures, they may not even know what I'm talking about, especially in this day and age. And so for us to have a common framework of what it actually means. So I use the TRIPS framework for teaching classroom procedures: teach, rehearse, instructional praise, and then support individual students. Well, if we both have that language and we both have that framework, Now we can actually collaboratively put procedures in. And I think it takes away me telling you what to do as being some kind of a negative thing, where we can actually talk about, hey, did you teach this? Did you have the kids rehearse it? If it's still breaking down, all right, let's look at your instructional praise and how can we collaborate that? How do I support you? So I'm super excited about that because it's one of those things that's been kicking around in my head for a long time.
I love that, Frederick. And I love it because you're such a systems guy that you're taking something just so incredibly needed right now, which is helping, especially with the number of emergency and alternatively certified teachers that we have, just knowing that, helping them to build their own instructional management, safety, and relationship standards, but also giving those principals the tools to support them in that so that that becomes collaborative work. You've also written a new book, and this is what I wanted to dive into next, which is A School Leader's Guide to Reclaiming Your Purpose. What motivated you to share this new resource?
Okay, before I do that, I want to share with people that the title of this book is really thanks to you. I think you came up with that title. The title I had, the working title was pretty wonky. And well, I just want to thank you. And everybody listening should know just what an incredible human being you are and how helpful and supportive you've been through this process. And yeah, and you suggested that title. So I really appreciate that because it captures the essence of the book. So I'm really passionate about the instructional leadership piece. And my dream and the thing I was preaching the first couple of years in my consulting business is how you build the systems around teacher support and teacher growth, right? There's very specific things that we can do to create a system where we have a strong instructional leadership team, where we're systematically working with teachers and helping them grow in really positive ways, and where that is a positive collaborative experience for everybody. So I would go in with, especially with assistant principals, and talk about this, and they would say, yes, but, and we would teach a practice and come back a month later and say, how did that go? And they would say, didn't get to it. So the book I really wanted to write was about creating a flywheel of professional development in your school. But I realized that nobody could use that book until we escaped this gravitational pull of urgency.
Mm.
So getting people to get a way to escape that pull of urgency and get to the place where we're being more strategic leaders, which means we can really focus on supporting and growing our teachers. That's the driver behind the book.
Let's take a moment to thank our sponsors, and then we'll be right back. Why is IXL used in 95 of the top 100 U.S. school districts? Because it works. IXL is research proven to benefit all student populations, including English language learners and special education classrooms. IXL is an all-inclusive online learning and teaching solution for K-12 that accelerates achievement, saves teachers time, and more. This one platform helps you accomplish what normally would require dozens of other tools. For example, as students practice skills, IXL automatically differentiates learning to help them master concepts at their own pace. Teachers get real-time insights into how students are performing so they can provide timely support. What I personally love about IXL are the personalized SAT and ACT study plans. Students just need to enter their most recent test score, and IXL automatically generates a custom list of skills they should work on to improve their scores. Discover what IXL can do for your school. Visit IXL.com/PM today. So let's dive into some of that content, Frederick, because you're right. Escaping the gravitational pull of the urgent so that we can do the things that we consider most meaningful is the hardest battle that leaders face every single day. One of my previous guests, Mark Schellinger, has a process that he's created to try to help leaders to think more strategically about their time management. Tell us some of the things that you found helpful in working with leaders. What are some of the takeaways that you've included in this guide?
So I've written it as a guide with 6 stages. And that first stage is really understanding where we are and why we're stuck in that urgent leadership paradigm. The next stage, which I think we'll revisit in a few minutes, is about making a U-turn about how you see your work. The third stage then is what I call powering down, right? Learning to pare down and let go of some of the things that we grab onto that really aren't core to our mission or our priorities. And then powering up, which is building the systems that support your ability to focus on your priorities. And then the fifth stage is, how do we take small pieces of time and leverage those into meaningful interactions where we can begin growing our teachers right away? And then finally, moving into strategic leadership. And strategic leaders prioritize people. They look at purpose instead of tasks. They focus on problems instead of symptoms, and look with a relentless view of progress, and don't confuse progress for action.
Mm.
So that's the framework in a nutshell.
So, oh, that's just so powerful. You know me, I'm a summarizer. So, one, where we are and why we're stuck there. Two, learning how to make that U-turn. Three, you call it powering down. Four, powering up. Five, um, turning those small pieces of time into meaningful interactions and developing others. And then six, that strategic leadership. So let's dive into some of those areas, Frederick. Why don't you take us through a few of those, because I want to encourage leaders to buy the book. We could sit here for hours and talk about all of these. So why don't you take us through two or three of those areas that are really important to you?
Yeah, let's jump into the U-turn, because you just
Okay.
said something a few minutes ago that is integral to that, and that's this idea of time management. And I think that's one of the actual challenges we have, and one of the places that we can get tripped up. Time management is not a bad thing, but time is really not the problem. And when we can start to understand that time is not the problem and stop trying to work our way out of the problem by managing time, that's when we make the U-turn. So there were 3 different experiences I've had that led to what I call the 3 epiphanies, right? These 3 ahas that happened over a period of time. And then when I saw that and put them together, it's just been a game changer for me. So the first epiphany is, you can't do everything, right? And we think that if I just work harder, if I just organize my time, if I just made better decisions, I could get it all done. But the fact is, you can't. None of us can get it all done. Once you realize that, that leads you to the second epiphany. And the second epiphany is, if I can't do everything, then I choose what gets done and what doesn't get done. Now, of course, the challenge there, and the challenge of being stuck in urgent leadership, is a lot of times we don't choose, right? We just are chasing this and that. We're playing whack-a-mole and whatever pops up in front of us. And so what happens is, our choices become unintentional. And so that second epiphany really invites us to become more intentional about our decision making, and to actually look at, I've got all this stuff. I know I can't do all this stuff. So what do I need to do? And I think that's really empowering, because now I get to begin to choose. And then the third epiphany, which is both liberating and terrifying at the same time, is that my choices reflect my values.
Mhm.
So if I'm spending a whole bunch of time on all my PowerPoints and all my reports and whatever else it is, my social media, and I'm not getting out into that new teacher's classroom, what does that say about what I value?
Wow. Okay. I'm just going to pause for a moment, because you're bringing back the memory of a conversation that I had with the Oklahoma principal who was just a couple of years ago, a secondary principal of the year here. Her name is Melissa Barlow. She was a guest back in the March episode. And, she's leading a school with 3,000 kids, and she's got 5 or 6 assistant principals. And your epiphanies are almost verbatim some of the things that she was telling me she does when trying to manage an impossible workload. Because when you have that many students, it's impossible. So let's drill down, Frederick, and into those epiphanies. How do those epiphanies then help you make that U-turn?
I think you go back to the values piece of it, right? What do I value? And that goes right to the book title, Reclaiming Our Purpose. What's our purpose? Why did I get into school administration? And probably I got into it because I wanted to have a bigger impact on kids. That's why most of us do this work, because we're passionate about providing more opportunities for kids to have agency in their lives. So as a principal, how do I do that? Right? You have 3 primary responsibilities. Number 1, keep everybody safe. Number 2, meet all your legal and legislative obligations. And then number 3, improve outcomes for kids. But we don't teach. It's teachers that improve outcomes for kids. So I reframe it: safety, legal stuff, and then supporting and growing teachers. And those 2 words, support and grow, are really intentional and have specific meanings. So when we talk about supporting teachers, we're talking about making it easier for them to do the work of teaching kids, right? So supporting is the systems piece. Supporting is how we work our schedules and how we put everything together, and the demands that we put on our teachers so that they can be focused on teaching. And then the growing piece is actually focused on the teacher, right? So teachers need 4 things to be good teachers. They need knowledge, skills, positive dispositions, and good health. And so when we're talking about growing teachers, we're talking about attending to those 4 pieces of the teacher. And so if those are our priorities, right, that's what we need to build our day around. And then once we have that clear, now time management can become a tool.
So the U-turn happens when we while facing the urgent, recognize that that urgent may not necessarily be the most important. Sometimes it is, but not always. So the U-turn happens when we can. I like to put it this way, Frederick. I call it switch your focus, which is like if you are in the middle of, and I actually borrowed that term from an Olympic cross country skier, Simon Kruger, who back in the 2018 Olympics, I watched him fall down at the beginning of his race. And I was like, oh, poor guy. But then I watched the race and he started inching back into the race and he ended up winning the gold medal. And when they interviewed him afterwards, they asked him, like, what was going through your mind? And he said, when I fell in that snow and I looked at all those racers out in front of me, I just thought, switch your focus, get it off the snow and back onto getting back to the front. And so I love that analogy of the U-turn and the switch the focus when you remember why were you placed there? If you're laying in the snow, why were you placed there? You're placed there to be what you said, doing all those things, making sure your school is safe, make sure that you're meeting those legal obligations, and making sure you're improving outcomes for students by supporting and growing your teachers, which I think is a good segue into that what you describe as the importance of powering down and powering up. So let's talk about that. If now that as we remind ourselves every single day, and this is a daily thing, this is why I'm here, then why do we need to both eliminate, but then also build systems?
Yeah. And I like the way you framed it. And I just say it's priority management, not time management, right? So if we can keep that, that's critical. So powering down is about learning to get away from doing the things that you don't have to be doing. If we think about the school, we think about how many people in a school actually have the ability to support and grow teachers. right? There's not many. You just talked about that school of 2,000 kids. You had 6 assistant principals. You had the principal and maybe 1 or 2 instructional coaches or curriculum people. So in that 2,000 school building with maybe 150 teachers, you've got 10 people maximum that are able to actively support and grow teachers. So when we think about that, if I'm one of the few people that can do that, then that's where and that's my priority. That's where I need to be focusing my time. And this is especially true with assistant principals as they come into the job and they want to be a servant leader and they want to help everybody. So they start helping. What do you need? What can I do? And they wind up taking on all these tasks and responsibilities that other people could do. And again, this isn't about being lazy and not wanting to help people, but you've got to be focused on doing what only you can do. And every yes is a no to something else because we can't do everything. And if we can't do everything, we have to choose what gets done. So am I going to go do the student of the week bulletin board? Or am I going to get into a classroom and work with a 3rd-year teacher who's struggling in classroom management or wants me to come in and help her to get better student engagement in the classroom? So powering down is getting rid of some of those other tasks.
Well, and it's not easy to do. It's one of the hardest questions that I ask leaders whenever I'm in a reflective session and we've gone through, the challenges that they're facing, the strategies that they need to move forward. And I almost hate asking this question, Frederick, but I always do, which is if you're saying yes to this, whatever that thing is that you're going to be working on next, what are you going to say no to? And in almost every single time, including when I'm on the other side of that question, there's a huge pause because we don't normally ask ourselves that question, which is, what am I going to say no to in order to actually make this other thing a priority? Talk about the powering up, because as we learn to say no to things, we also have to build systems to support the outcomes that we want to accomplish. And I know you and I've talked about this in other settings too, that so often we ask ourselves, why are we getting the same outcome? But we don't often ask ourselves, what is the system that we've created that's producing that same outcome? So talk a little bit about why in your book you focus so much on powering up.
Yeah, I think 2 of the biggest areas when we think about systems are communication and then our systems and structures around our instructional leadership team. And certainly there's a lot more than that, but those are the 2 things I focus most in the book. One of the things we have to realize is just because we've made that U-turn and now I say, hey, I'm going to be a priority focused leader, that doesn't mean that everybody else around me understands what that means, right? And so if I'm starting to power down on things and not do certain things, I need to engage in really active and intentional communication and help people understand. If I'm not doing that bulletin board or I'm not investing the time in the parent newsletter or whatever it is, what am I doing with that time? Here are my priorities. And this is why I'm not doing this, because I'm committed to being in your classroom. I'm committed to supporting teachers. I'm committed to helping collect the data and share back with you in the areas that you're trying to grow as a teacher. So teaching about what my priorities are, and then using some specific forms of language so that we begin all using that language, and then that reinforces us in building out for my priorities. That part of that is helping other people be able to focus on their priorities. So now if we're all talking that language and we're all being able to focus on what our priorities are, now we're a system that's working together.
So, Frederick, what I want to ask you next is what I think is so unique about your book compared to others that I've read is you are very practical. And the reason you called this a guide is because it's like a guidebook. In every chapter, you have very specific practical exercises that leaders can do. So talk a little bit about that. As the writer of this work, why was it so important for you to include in this book, in every single chapter, such specific guidance for exercises that help you do the things that we're actually talking about?
Yeah, in my higher ed time, I was able to work with a lot of teacher leaders who were aspiring principals. And I would form relationships with them, teach, and then watch them go out and move into the assistant principalship. And of course, we stayed in touch. And so I've really been able to hear and absorb a lot of their stories and a lot of the challenges that they had. So when I was writing this book, I really had a couple of specific people in mind. So I didn't write the book for assistant principals. I wrote the book for my friend Maria, right? And so he's thinking about, what do I need to put in her hands that is going to be helpful? So this is not a big book, right? The book's about 135 pages, I think. And I designed each stage that you should be able to sit down and read a stage in about 15 minutes. And my hope is that someone will sit down with a pen and a marker and just underline the stuff that makes sense to them. And then there are lots of reflection questions to help people think. Because again, one of the big shifts, if I'm going to manage priorities and not time, then I have to be very intentional. So I try to support that in the book through the reflection questions. And then part of my philosophy is, if we spend time together and you don't walk away with something that can instantly make your life better, then we've missed an opportunity. I'm obsessed with this idea of progress and moving from A to B. So at the end of each chapter are challenges, which are really activities that are offered up for people to take the content and apply it immediately to make their lives better.
Well, it's incredibly practical, Frederick. So, exercises that help leaders with reflections and intentional targeting. And I would also add the word engineering, how they want to move from those ideas into actually seeing this work within their own schools. I know we need to wrap this up, but I want to give you an opportunity to share any other parting thoughts that you had for leaders who may be interested in connecting with this resource, but also how can listeners stay connected with you? Because you not only have written this book, but you have a great podcast, you have a lot of great training available. So share some parting thoughts and how listeners can stay connected with you.
I think the two biggest things I'd like people to three things. So first, we've already touched on this, but be intentional, right? Stop going through the motions and letting the urgency drive you, and just start becoming aware and start becoming intentional about the choices you make. The second thing is then to realize that as a leader, you will never be complete. It's a journey. You and I have talked multiple times, right? We're both still trying to grow. We have so much room to grow. And the number of days that I catch myself trying to manage my time instead of manage my priorities, it's a constant battle. So as leaders, we're never going to be a finished product. And there's incredible beauty in that, because every day we get a chance to grow, every day we get a little bit of a chance to be better. And then the final thing I would say is, you are much better off walking this journey with somebody else. The journey of leadership is by definition a collaborative journey. And I know when I wrote the book, I kept thinking, if people can do this together, if the five of us on our leadership team can take this and do this together, now we can all support each other. Because the stuff in the book is simple. It's not rocket science. It's simple, but execution is hard. We all know that. And so bringing that team of people along with you to develop that shared language, to have the shared frameworks, to challenge the things that may not work in your situation, is absolutely critical. It's critical if you're going to engage in the journey to reclaim your purpose, but it's also critical when they listen to a great podcast episode of yours, or embark on any other part of growth, like travel with people.
Well, Frederick Buskey, thank you so much for the opportunity to reconnect you with my listeners. And I'll go ahead and say this because you and I will probably have had this experience by the time this recording comes out, but you and I have actually scheduled some time to walk together. And so I'm looking so forward to being in North Carolina in the next few weeks and the beautiful part of the state that you live right outside of Asheville, to walk some of those trails together. What a neat way to wrap up this whole conversation. We started off by talking about your love for trails and my love for the outdoors. We're going to get to spend some time walking together, but Principal Matters listeners, I just want to say this to you, that intentionality, that admission that you'll never be complete, but that commitment to walking this journey with other people, it keeps, I'm going to use the word you used, Frederick, it keeps you present. It helps you remember why you're here in the first place, and the importance of the work that you're doing. So thank you for the work that you're doing, Frederick. I don't think you shared your contact info, so tell folks how they can stay connected with you.
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn as Frederick Buskey, and I love conversing with people and making that connection. So if you want to email me at Frederick Buskey, you can reach me there. And then I host the Assistant Principal podcast, so you can find that everywhere. And I have to say the book's on Amazon, right? Is it okay?
Well, find it there. Frederick Buskey, thank you so much for all that you do. And Principal Matters listeners, thank you for doing what matters. We'll talk to you again next week.
Well, thank you. This has been such a great time.
You'll find free resources like this one at williamdparker.com. Subscribe for our free weekly newsletter, which contains bonus material, and also check out the links for Grow Academies, Masterminds, Executive Coaching, and Keynote presentations for my books, as well as from Principal Matters Associates. You can find out more under our speakers tab at williamdparker.com. Thank you for learning together, and thank you for doing what matters.